The Forgotten History of Saukenuk, and the Tragedy of Black Hawk. Most people driving down 11th Street in Rock Island have no idea what used to stand beneath the pavement. They don't know that the parking lots, houses, and storefronts sit on top of what was once one of the largest and most important Native American cities in North America, the capital of the Sauk Nation, a place called Saukenuk. Saukenuk began growing around 1730. When the Sauk and their close allies, the Meskwaki, relocated from Wisconsin after years of conflict with the French. They chose their new home with intention, a point of land between the Rock River and the Mississippi, where the soil was light and fertile, the water was clean, and the rapids produced fish in such quantities that early visitors said you could practically scoop them from the river. For more than a century, this location became the political, economic, and cultural center of Sauk life. Visitors who came here never described Saukenuk as a village. Jonathan Carver, an explorer who passed through in 1766, called it a town. Long lodges arranged along wide avenues, a central gathering place, and a population that dwarfed the nearby colonial outposts. He called it the largest and best-built Indian town he had ever seen. Thomas Forsyth, writing half a century later, agreed. By 1826, he estimated that nearly 4,800 Sauk people lived in and around Saukenuk, making it one of the largest population centers anywhere on the upper Mississippi. The layout reflected careful planning. A long north-south avenue ran from the bluffs down toward the water, lined with lodges. A shorter east-west avenue formed a T-shaped grid. One end of the settlement held the council lodge, where leaders met and diplomacy was conducted. Another open space served as the main street, a wide communal area where the community gathered for games, ceremonies, and celebrations. Behind the lodges, the bluffs fed the village with several clean water springs. Along the river, rapids teemed with fish, and stretching across the land east of the village were the real power of Saukenuk, roughly 800 acres of corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins, enough to sustain thousands of people. Black Hawk described the surrounding land with unmistakable pride. The land around our village was covered with blue grass, which made excellent pasture for our horses. Several fine springs broke out of the bluff. The rapids furnished us with an abundance of excellent fish. The land never failed to produce good crops. Our children never cried with hunger, nor were our people ever in want. Daily life followed an annual rhythm that had held steady for generations. Each spring, families returned from their winter hunting camps to the long lodges along Saukenuk's wide avenues. Women led the agricultural work, clearing fields, repairing storage pits, and planting enormous expanses of corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins, industrial-scale fields by 18th century standards. These fields fed not only the Sauk and Meskwaki, but also the steady stream of traders and travelers who passed through. Men fished the rapids at the mouth of the Rock River and traveled along the bluffs, gathering berries, roots, and wild greens. Traders arrived to purchase surplus corn or exchange goods, cloth, metal tools, rifles, gunpowder, and shot. Diplomats, fur traders, and American officials came here regularly, meeting with leaders in the council lodge to negotiate everything from trade routes to hunting grounds. Summer brought gatherings and ceremonies along the esplanade. Children gathered firewood or learned to hunt, while older men repaired weapons and prepared for the fall hunt. By late summer, the fields were heavy with crops. Harvest season brought the whole community together. Everything had to be dried, stored, and secured for the winter ahead. Food was placed in underground storage pits that could keep corn safe for months. And then came one of the most predictable moments in the Sauk calendar, dispersal. After the harvest, Saukenuk's large population broke into smaller winter groups, each moving into hunting territories across present-day Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Men tracked deer, elk, and buffalo, while women maintained winter lodges and processed meat and hides. Late winter meant maple sugaring. Sap from groves along the bluffs was boiled down into sugar cakes used year-round. When the sap stopped flowing, winter was ending. Families returned to Saukenuk, lit fires in their longhouses, repaired tools, prepared the fields, and began the cycle again. This structure produced stability. reliable food, reliable water, and reliable community. Observers often remark that the Sauk lived in a world defined by order and abundance. Many wore European-style clothing and used rifles purchased through the fur trade. Their lodges were large and well-built. Their alliance with the Meskwaki strengthened both nations politically and economically. And for decades, the Sauk and Meskwaki controlled large portions of the Mississippi River Valley, maintaining trade networks and alliances that stretched across the region. Saukenuk was powerful, organized, and deeply rooted, and that is precisely what made it a target. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the United States was pushing aggressively westward. Powerful nations had fought over this land long before Americans arrived, the French, the British, and rival tribal nations before them. But now a new political force was expanding into the region, backed by a government that viewed every acre of Sauk territory as land waiting to be purchased, claimed, or taken. American officials saw farmland, the Sauk saw home. For more than a century, Saukenuk had seemed deeply rooted and immovable. But the Sauk and Meskwaki did not begin their story in Illinois. Their path to Saukenuk stretched across centuries in several regions. To understand why Saukenuk grew into such a large and influential settlement, you have to look at what pushed these tribes west in the first place, and how their alliance formed. In the early 1600s, both the Sauk and Meskwaki lived far to the east, in the region that is now eastern Canada and the western Great Lakes. They were established nations with their own villages, hunting grounds, and political systems. But the 17th century was a period of intense conflict in the Great Lakes. The Iroquois Confederacy, armed with European weapons and driven by the fur trade, expanded aggressively into territories held by other tribes. These wars displaced several native nations, including the Sauk and Meskwaki. By the 1650s, the two tribes moved westward and settled in present-day Wisconsin, especially around Green Bay and the Fox River. For a time, the new location offered stability. They hunted, traded, and rebuilt their communities. But the arrival of French traders and missionaries quickly changed their world. The Meskwaki in particular had a contentious relationship with the French. The French expected native nations to trade exclusively with them and to remain loyal allies. The Meskwaki refused to fall in line. They resisted French demands, controlled important waterways, and maintained their independence in trade. This led to decades of conflict known as the Fox Wars, some of the most brutal wars in early Great Lakes history. From 1712 to 1733, the French tried repeatedly to break Meskwaki power. French officials even discussed the possibility of eliminating the tribe entirely. The Meskwaki survived only because of their determination and because the Sauk offered protection and support. This moment cemented the alliance between the Sauk and Meskwaki. The two tribes became politically and militarily linked, sharing territory, resources, and leadership responsibilities. When the pressure in Wisconsin grew too intense, they moved together again, this time toward the Mississippi River Valley. By the early 1730s, the Sauk and Meskwaki migrated south and settled at the point of land between the Rock River and the Mississippi. They chose the location because it met everything a large community needed: reliable water, fertile soil, defensible terrain, and access to transportation and trade routes. The Mississippi and Rock Rivers connected them to a wide region. The bluffs gave them natural protection. The soil supported large agricultural fields. Fishing grounds were abundant. This site became Saukenuk. It didn't take long for Saukenuk to become the central settlement of the Sauk Nation. The Meskwaki built their own village to the north, in what is now downtown Rock Island, and the two communities operated closely together. Both tribes hunted over a wide territory that included most of Iowa, parts of Missouri, and portions of Wisconsin and Illinois. Their influence grew steadily throughout the 18th century. This entire region, from the Wisconsin River to the Missouri, became recognized as Sauk and Meskwaki territory. They signed agreements with French, British, and later American representatives. They traded furs, lead, and agricultural goods, and they maintained a strong warrior tradition that discouraged most attacks. By the time the United States began expanding into the Midwest after the Revolutionary War, the Sauk and Meskwaki were firmly established. They weren't a loose collection of small camps. They were a unified, organized presence, controlling key hunting grounds, rivers, and trade routes. Because of their prominence, the Sauk and Meskwaki were caught in the middle of shifting alliances between European and American powers. They traded with the French, negotiated with the British, and dealt with the United States, sometimes all within the same decade. Each outside power wanted influence over the same territory. Each wanted native support, especially during wars. All of this pressure eventually focused on Saukenuk. The settlement's size, strategic importance, and long-established fields made it one of the most sought-after indigenous sites in the region. American officials saw its location as prime land for settlement. Traders saw economic opportunity. Politicians saw a chance to expand into Illinois. The U.S. government believed treaties were the fastest way to claim Indian lands, and in 1804 it created the most significant point of tension in Sauk history. In that year, 5 Sauk and Meskwaki men traveled to St. Louis. They went there to discuss a murder case involving a Sauk warrior and an American settler. The meeting was supposed to address only that issue. But while the group was in the city, Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison presented them with a treaty. According to U.S. officials, the treaty would settle the case and create peace. The document the men signed ceded 51 million acres of Sauk and Meskwaki land. That land included almost all of northern Illinois, parts of Missouri and Wisconsin, and the area around Saukenuk itself. In return, the tribes were promised goods worth roughly $2,200, plus an annual annuity of $1,000. The Sauk leadership never accepted this treaty. Under Sauk law, no agreement involving land could be valid unless it was approved by the full tribal council. The 5 men who signed the treaty did not have that authority, and the Sauk council rejected the agreement as soon as they learned of it. But the United States saw it differently. The treaty went to Washington. The Senate ratified it. From that moment on, the U.S. government considered all of northern Illinois and large parts of surrounding states to be legally purchased. The tribes were told they could remain on the land only until American settlers wanted it. That condition created problems almost immediately. Throughout the early 1800s, white settlement in Illinois increased. American officials repeatedly reminded the Sauk that the land no longer belonged to them. Tension grew around Saukenuk as the Sauk refused to leave an area where their families had lived for generations. In 1780, decades before the treaty, George Rogers Clark had already burned Saukenuk during the Revolutionary War to punish the Sauk for being sympathetic to the British. After that attack, the Sauk rebuilt. But after the 1804 treaty, the threat to Saukenuk was far more serious. This time, the United States wasn't punishing the Sauk for choosing the wrong side. It was acting on a legal claim, even if the Sauk believed the treaty was fraudulent. The Sauk lived in a position that made conflict almost unavoidable. They had a thriving community, long-established fields, and ancestral burial sites at Saukenuk. The U.S. government believed that all of this stood in the way of American settlers. Both sides held firm to their claims. Black Hawk, who was born at Saukenuk around 1767, refused to accept the treaty from the moment he heard about it. He believed the signers had been tricked. He believed the Sauk had never willingly sold their homeland, and he saw himself as responsible for defending the place where his ancestors were buried. During the War of 1812, Black Hawk joined the British in military actions along the Mississippi. He did so because the British, unlike the Americans, did not claim Sauk land. This choice made Black Hawk a figure of suspicion in the United States and complicated relations long after the war ended. By the late 1820s, pressure around Saukenuk reached a breaking point. White settlers moved into the area in growing numbers, claiming land the U.S. believed it had purchased in 1804. The Sauk continued to farm their fields, hunt along the riverbanks, and live in their lodges. They argued that they had never sold the land. The United States insisted they had. In 1828, the discovery of lead deposits around Galena brought even more settlers into the region. The Sauk saw their hunting grounds reduced. They watched settlers build near their fields and waterways. The conflict grew more personal and more immediate. Rumors and reports reached the Illinois government claiming that Black Hawk was preparing to resist removal. Some of these reports were exaggerated, others were based on misunderstandings, and some were simply false. But in 1831, Illinois Governor John Reynolds used these reports as justification to send militia forces to Saukenuk. Black Hawk had only a few hundred people with him, many of them women, children, and elders. Facing overwhelming numbers, he withdrew across the Mississippi River and agreed to avoid returning to Illinois. As soon as he left, the militia destroyed Saukenuk. They burned lodges, tore up fields, vandalized the cemetery, and dug up graves. For the Sauk, this was an extreme violation. Their homes, crops, and burial places were gone. The destruction hardened Black Hawk's resolve. He still believed the Sauk had never sold their land, and he refused to accept that the United States had the right to remove his people by force. In 1832, Black Hawk made a decision that changed everything. Despite the agreement he signed the previous year, in which he promised not to return to Illinois, he chose to cross back over the Mississippi. He believed that Saukenuk was still the rightful home of his people. He also believed the 1804 treaty had never been valid. After the destruction of Saukenuk in 1831, he felt the tribe had been pushed too far. Black Hawk did not return with an army. His group included around 1,000 people, but most were not warriors. Many were women, children, and elders. Fewer than 200 were fighting men. His intention, according to his own account, was to plant corn and reclaim the fields along the Rock River. He also held out hope that the British in Canada or certain tribal allies might support him if conflict broke out. This belief turned out to be mistaken. The Illinois government interpreted his return as a hostile invasion. Rumors spread quickly. Newspapers printed exaggerated accounts. Settlers fled their homes, and the situation escalated before Black Hawk's band had even reached their former territory. The first real confrontation occurred at Stillman's Run. A group of Illinois militiamen, inexperienced and poorly trained, advanced toward Black Hawk's position. When a small Sauk delegation approached under a white flag, the militia fired on them. Black Hawk's warriors responded. The militia panicked and fled in confusion. Reports claimed that Black Hawk commanded thousands of warriors, which increased public fear even though the truth was far different. After Stillman's Run, the U.S. Army became heavily involved. Regular troops joined state militias in pursuing Black Hawk's band northward through Illinois and into Wisconsin. The Sauk were constantly on the move. Food became scarce. Many families were already weakened from winter and from the long march through unfamiliar territory. Black Hawk's group was not advancing toward battle. They were trying to avoid it. Several small engagements occurred during the pursuit. One of the most significant took place at Wisconsin Heights. Black Hawk's warriors fought a delaying action that allowed the women, children, and elderly to cross the Wisconsin River and continue moving west. The battle slowed the U.S. forces but did not stop them. The Sauk were exhausted, and their supplies were nearly gone. By late summer, Black Hawk's band approached the Mississippi River again. They hoped to cross back into Iowa and find safety among the tribes that remained there, but U.S. forces caught up with them at the riverbank. The final confrontation became known as the Battle of Bad Axe. Most accounts describe Bad Axe not as a battle, but as a massacre. Black Hawk's group had no defensive position, and many of the people present were non-combatants. As they tried to cross the river in makeshift rafts or by swimming, U.S. soldiers opened fire. Some Sauk attempted to surrender. Others fled into the water. Many drowned. Others were shot in the back as they tried to escape. More than 150 Sauk and Meskwaki were killed at the site. Many more died in the days and weeks before and after the battle. By the end of the war, over 1,000 members of the two tribes had been killed, including large numbers of women and children. American casualties were only a fraction of that number. After Bad Axe, Black Hawk had no remaining options. He surrendered to the U.S. government and was taken into custody. His capture received extensive attention in Eastern newspapers. Officials viewed the surrender as the final step in securing Illinois for American settlement. For the Sauk and Meskwaki, the Black Hawk War marked a turning point. The loss of life was immense. Their political influence in the region collapsed. Their villages were gone, and American settlers quickly claimed the lands they had been forced to abandon. The Rock River Valley, once the center of their world, no longer belonged to them. The war also cemented Black Hawk's reputation, though not in the way he might have expected. The U.S. government treated him as a symbol of resistance, even while misunderstanding his motives. He had not tried to start a war. He had tried to return home. After his surrender, he was sent east, where he became a public figure. Crowds gathered to see him. Newspapers printed descriptions of his appearance. No one who saw him understood the scale of what his people had just lost. The government believed that displaying Black Hawk to the public would reinforce the idea that the United States had total control over the region. They wanted a message sent to native nations throughout the Midwest and to American citizens who were watching events unfold in newspapers. So instead of imprisoning Black Hawk in the territory where the war had taken place, they transported him east. Black Hawk and the other leaders were taken first to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri. Then they were moved to several cities along the East Coast, including Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Most of the people who came to see him had never encountered a tribal leader before. Many newspapers printed dramatic accounts of his appearance, his clothing, and his expression. He met President Andrew Jackson in Washington. The meeting was formal and brief. Jackson viewed Black Hawk primarily as a defeated enemy, not as a representative of a sovereign people. U.S. officials questioned him about the war, about his decision to return to Illinois, and about future intentions. Black Hawk gave measured responses, but the context was uneven. The Sauk view of the 1804 treaty, that it had not been valid, did not affect how the government treated the situation. After months of traveling under guard, Black Hawk and the other captives returned west. Their release came with strict conditions. They were required to reside west of the Mississippi River and forbidden from attempting to return to their former homeland. They also needed to meet with tribal councils to discourage further conflict. Black Hawk complied. The war had cost too much for any attempt to continue resisting. In 1833, Black Hawk dictated his autobiography to an interpreter. It was titled The Life of Black Hawk and became the first Native American autobiography published in the United States. The book reached a wide audience. Most readers had little understanding of Sauk culture or the true nature of the conflict, but the book nevertheless became a bestseller. The autobiography gave Black Hawk a voice at a moment when Eastern audiences were eager for accounts of frontier life. But Black Hawk did not benefit materially from the book's success. He returned to his people with no land, no political authority, and limited influence. The Sauk and Meskwaki had been fractured by relocation. Their leadership structure had changed. Many families had lost relatives in the war. The surviving community struggled to rebuild in unfamiliar territory. Black Hawk settled near the Des Moines River in what is now southeast Iowa. He lived in a small cabin and spent time hunting, visiting nearby tribes, and speaking occasionally with U.S. agents. He continued to express his belief that the Sauk had been wronged. He also emphasized repeatedly that his decision to return to Illinois in 1832 had been motivated by a desire to reclaim Saukenuk, not to start a war. His health declined in the late 1830s. He died in 1838 at 71 years old. His body was placed upright in a small log mausoleum built specifically for him. The burial followed Sauk tradition and reflected his status as a respected leader, even if he had never held the title of chief. Years after his burial, grave robbers stole his remains. They were recovered by territorial officials, displayed for a time, and eventually lost in a museum fire. Black Hawk's life became part of American memory, but it was remembered unevenly. In and around the Quad Cities, his name became attached to towns, counties, festivals, teams, and schools. But these uses often stripped away the context of what had happened to his people. His name survived more visibly than the history of Saukenuk or the details of the Black Hawk War. The Sauk and Meskwaki still remember him differently. For them, he is connected directly to the loss of their homeland and the destruction of their villages. His resistance is tied to a long line of decisions made to protect family burial grounds, farmland, and community stability. The Sauk and Meskwaki communities that exist today descend from the people who survived the war, crossed the river, and rebuilt their lives in new territory. Black Hawk never returned to Saukenuk, and neither did his people. The site where he was born and where his ancestors lived for generations became a place occupied by settlers, then towns, then streets and businesses. Black Hawk State Park preserves a part of the landscape, but the scale of what once existed is difficult to picture when looking at Rock Island today. The story of Saukenuk ended in the 1830s, but the influence of that community extends much further. Its history shaped the settlement of Illinois, the politics of the Midwest, and the identity of the Sauk and Meskwaki people. In the generations that followed, Black Hawk's legacy grew far beyond the circumstances of his final years. Artists, historians, and politicians recast him in ways that suited their own purposes, often simplifying or romanticizing his story while overlooking the deeper history of Saukenuk and the people who lived there. Yet the communities descended from the Sauk and Meskwaki have continued to honor him not as a symbol, but as an ancestor whose choices were rooted in responsibility to his homeland. Their survival, adaptation, and ongoing cultural life testify to a resilience that outlasted both the war and the narratives written about it. The memory of Black Hawk endures not only in monuments and place names, but in the lived continuity of the people whose history he sought to protect.